Daniel Brooks noticed her before he understood why his chest felt tight. She was standing across the street, half in shadow beside the old maple tree that had been there longer than most houses on the block. Evening traffic moved between them in slow bursts of headlights. She didn't wave, didn't call his name. She just stood there. For a moment, he thought memory was playing tricks again. That happens sometimes when the past sits too long in a person's bones. Then she stepped forward. 20 years collapsed into a single quiet step. Daniel felt his hand tighten around the grocery bag he was carrying. Something inside it slipped and cracked, but he didn't look down. Because Evelyn Chen had just walked back into his life, and nothing about that moment felt accidental. Daniel didn't cross the street right away. Cars passed between them in uneven lines, headlights sliding over wet pavement. Someone somewhere was playing music too loud with the windows down. Ordinary noise. The kind of evening that usually passed without asking anything from him. But he stood there longer than necessary. Evelyn hadn't changed in the ways he expected. Time had done its quiet work lines near her eyes. A different way of standing. Shoulders slightly drawn in like someone used to carrying things alone. But the way she looked at him, that part hadn't moved. Not really. Daniel shifted the grocery bag in his hand. Eggs, bread, the small carton of milk Lily had asked for that morning before school. One of the eggs had cracked when his grip tightened earlier. He could feel it leaking through the cardboard. Still, he didn't look down. Evelyn stepped off the curb first. Traffic slowed. A driver leaned on the horn once, sharp and irritated. She crossed anyway, calm, steady, like she had already decided the road would make room. Daniel watched her come closer. For a moment, he had the strange thought that if he blinked, she might disappear again, like she had 20 years ago. He didn't blink. She stopped a few feet away, close enough now that the details came back without asking permission. The small scar near her chin, the faint crease between her eyebrows when she was thinking too hard. They stood like that for several seconds. Neither spoke. Finally, Evelyn let out a quiet breath. "Hi, Daniel." Her voice was softer than he remembered. Or maybe it was the street noise fading around them. Hard to tell. Daniel nodded once. "Hi." The word felt stiff, leaving his mouth, like it had waited too long to be used. Another pause stretched between them. Not uncomfortable exactly, just heavy. Like both of them were aware that 20 years of silence doesn't break cleanly. Evelyn glanced at the grocery bag. "You still buy too many eggs?" Daniel looked down then, noticing the damp cardboard. One corner sagged slightly. He gave a small shrug. "Some habits stay." A faint smile touched her mouth. It disappeared almost immediately. They stood there another moment. Daniel felt something shift inside his chest. Not anger exactly. Not yet. Just the awareness that the person standing in front of him had once occupied every quiet space in his future, and then one day, she hadn't. No explanation that made sense. No goodbye that felt real. Just absence. He had spent years learning how to place that absence somewhere safe inside himself. Somewhere it wouldn't interfere with raising Lily. Working. Paying bills. The ordinary rhythm of days. Seeing Evelyn again felt like someone had opened a door he had carefully nailed shut. A car passed, splashing through shallow water along the curb. Daniel cleared his throat. "You visiting someone?" Evelyn looked down the street for a moment before answering. "No." He waited. She didn't add anything. The silence stretched again. Daniel shifted his weight slightly. The grocery bag creaked. "My house is that way," he said after a moment, nodding toward the corner. "Lily's probably waiting." The name hung between them. Evelyn's eyes flickered. "Lily?" she repeated quietly. Daniel noticed the way her hands tightened slightly at her sides. Small movement. Easy to miss. "She's 19 now," he said. Evelyn nodded once. "I thought she might be." Daniel watched her carefully. "You thought?" Her gaze lifted back to his. "I kept track when I could." The answer came slowly, like each word had to be measured before it left her mouth. Daniel felt the first hint of something harder move through his chest. "Did you?" Not quite a question. Evelyn didn't react defensively. She just stood there absorbing the weight of it. "I know how that sounds," she said. Daniel looked away briefly toward the dim porch lights along the block. For years he had imagined what he might say if he ever saw her again. Angry things, questions that demanded answers. Standing here now, most of those sentences felt strangely distant, like they belonged to someone younger, someone who hadn't spent 2 decades learning to keep life simple. "You disappeared," he said finally. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment. "I know." The way she said it stopped the conversation from becoming sharper. Not defensive, not dismissive, just tired. Daniel studied her face again. There was something different in the way she carried herself. Not just age, something heavier. "What do you want, Evelyn?" The question came out quieter than he intended. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. 5 minutes. That's all? For tonight. Daniel considered that. 5 minutes didn't sound like much. But 5 minutes could open things that had been closed for 20 years. He thought about Lily sitting at the kitchen table, probably halfway through her homework, headphones on, tapping a pencil against the notebook the way she always did when she was thinking. He promised himself long ago that the past wouldn't reach into the life he built with her. Still, 5 minutes. Daniel sighed softly. "There's a park 2 blocks down." Evelyn nodded immediately, relief passing briefly through her expression before she managed to hide it. They started walking. Not side by side at first. There was half a step of distance between them, like both were unsure where the edges of the other person existed now. The neighborhood looked the same as always. Old houses with narrow porches, the smell of someone grilling meat somewhere nearby, a dog barking behind a fence. Ordinary evening things. Daniel found himself aware of every sound, every step. After a while, Evelyn spoke again. "I didn't expect you to agree." "You said 5 minutes. That doesn't mean you had to give them." Daniel shrugged slightly. "Figured I'd hear what you came to say." She nodded. They reached the small park a minute later. Just a few benches and a rusted swing set that had been there since Lily was a kid. Daniel placed the grocery bag carefully on the bench. One egg had fully broken now. The carton sagged. He didn't bother fixing it. Evelyn sat at the far end of the bench, leaving space between them. For a moment, neither spoke. The air felt cooler here. Finally, she looked toward him again. "My father is dying." Daniel blinked once. The sentence arrived without warning. He leaned back slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that." Evelyn nodded, but her expression didn't change. "He asked about you." Daniel frowned faintly. Why would he do that? Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched the empty swing set move slightly in the wind. Then she said something that made Daniel's chest tighten in a way he hadn't expected. "Because he's the reason I left." Silence settled hard across the bench. Daniel stared at her. For a moment, he thought he had heard wrong. "You're going to have to explain that," he said quietly. Evelyn nodded once. "I know." She folded her hands together slowly, like someone preparing to touch a wound that had never fully healed, and Daniel felt, very clearly, that the 5 minutes she asked for were about to become something else entirely. Daniel didn't answer right away. The park had grown quiet in that particular way. Evenings sometimes do, when most people are already home and the street sounds thin out into distant pieces. Somewhere a screen door closed. A dog barked once, then stopped. He kept his eyes on the swing set. Rust along the chains, the seat turning slightly in the wind. Her father. Daniel tried to fit the words together in his head, but they didn't settle. "You left," he said slowly. "You didn't answer calls. Letters came back unopened." His voice stayed calm, but there was a pressure behind it now. "I drove to your apartment twice." Evelyn's shoulders stiffened slightly. "You were gone," he continued. "No forwarding address. Nothing." He turned his head toward her. "And now you're telling me your father did that." It wasn't anger yet. But the space between the sentences had sharpened. Evelyn didn't look at him immediately. She was studying her hands. "I thought you hated me." Daniel almost laughed, but the sound didn't fully form. "That would have been easier." She nodded faintly. "I figured that later, Later. Another pause. Daniel leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. Start at the part that makes sense, he said. Evelyn drew in a slow breath. You remember the week before I left? Daniel did. He remembered it with a kind of unwanted clarity. Her father had come into town. That alone had shifted things. The man had always carried himself like he owned whatever room he stepped into. Quiet voice. Expensive suits. A way of looking at people that made it clear he was measuring them. Daniel had been 24 then. Working 2 jobs, still figuring things out. Not impressive by the standards of men like that. I remember, Daniel said. He visited you. Daniel nodded. At the garage. The memory surfaced fully now. Late afternoon, oil on his hands. The man standing just outside the service bay, perfectly still, watching him work like he was inspecting a machine. You said you didn't know about that, Daniel added. Evelyn's eyes closed briefly. I didn't. Daniel waited. He told me you came to see him afterward, she said quietly. Daniel's head turned sharply toward her. What? Evelyn nodded once, slowly. He said you went to his office, that you asked him to stay out of our lives. Daniel stared at her. I never did that. I know. The words came out quickly. But Daniel felt something shift inside his chest anyway. He told me you said you didn't want the responsibility. Daniel stood up suddenly. The movement startled a small bird from the grass nearby. That's not just wrong, he said, pacing a few steps away from the bench. That's insane. Evelyn watched him carefully. He was very convincing. Daniel ran a hand across the back of his neck. He said you weren't ready for a family, she continued. That you admitted it yourself. Daniel let out a breath through his teeth. I never even met him alone after that first day. I know. You keep saying that now. Her voice softened. I learned the truth later. Daniel stopped pacing. The wind pushed lightly through the trees. When? He asked. Evelyn looked toward the ground. 2 years ago. Daniel blinked. 2 years. She nodded. He had a stroke, not the one he's dying from now, the first one. Daniel crossed his arms slowly, and suddenly he decides to tell you he lied. Not suddenly. Her mouth tightened slightly. It took months before he said anything clear. Daniel studied her face. You telling me he destroyed our lives and just admitted it one afternoon? Evelyn shook her head. No. Another long pause stretched out. Then she said quietly, he thought he was protecting me. Daniel let out a short, humorless breath. That's always the excuse. Evelyn didn't argue. She simply continued. He told me you came to see him, that you asked for money to leave town. Daniel stared at her again. What? He said you wanted a fresh start somewhere else. Daniel's jaw tightened. And you believe that? Her voice dropped. You didn't come to see me. The sentence landed softly, but it carried its own weight. Daniel opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. He had tried, called, written, driven across town twice. But he hadn't broken down doors, hadn't forced answers. Back then, pride and confusion had tangled together until they became silence. Evelyn noticed the hesitation. I thought the choice had already been made, she said. Daniel looked away. The swing creaked again in the breeze. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he walked back and sat on the bench again. Not as close as before. Why now? He asked. Evelyn took a slow breath. He asked for you yesterday. Daniel frowned. Why would he want that? He says he needs to say something before it's over. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of the broken egg carton. Sticky. He hadn't even noticed earlier. And you believe him now? Evelyn hesitated. I believe people change when they run out of time. Daniel looked at her carefully. Do you forgive him? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she watched the empty park. I don't know yet, she said finally. The honesty in that answer surprised him. Another quiet minute passed. Daniel stood again, lifting the grocery bag. I should go. Evelyn nodded slowly. I didn't expect more than that tonight. He took a few steps, then stopped. Does Lily know? Evelyn asked. Daniel turned halfway back. About us. She nodded. A little. He thought about his daughter's curious questions over the years. The old photo tucked into a drawer, the one he had never thrown away. She knows there was someone important once. Evelyn looked down again. Daniel hesitated. Where are you staying? A hotel near the river. How long? I don't know. Daniel studied her face. 20 years had added lines and distance, but the person underneath, he could still see pieces of her. I'll think about it, he said finally. Evelyn's eyes lifted. About seeing him. She nodded quietly. That's all I'm asking. Daniel turned and started walking toward home. After a few steps, he heard her voice behind him. Daniel. He stopped but didn't turn yet. I never stopped wondering what our life would have looked like, she said. The sentence hung in the air. Daniel stood still for a long moment. Then he said, without looking back, I did. And he walked the rest of the way home. Daniel let himself into the house quietly. The front door always made a soft clicking sound when it closed. Tonight it sounded louder than usual. He stood there a second with the grocery bag still in his hand, listening. Music leaked faintly from the hallway. Lily's room. Same routine as most evenings. He walked to the kitchen and set the bag on the counter. The carton of eggs sagged when he opened it. One corner soaked through completely. Daniel stared at it longer than necessary. Then he pulled a paper towel from the roll and wiped the counter slowly. Small movements. Ordinary tasks. His hands needed something simple to do. After a minute, the music in Lily's room stopped. A door opened. You took forever, Lily called from the hallway. Daniel glanced toward the doorway. She stepped into the kitchen a moment later, tying her hair back with one hand, phone still in the other. 19. Sometimes he forgot that number until moments like this. The way she moved through the house with easy confidence. The way the world outside already seemed to belong to her. She stopped when she saw the broken eggs. Oh no. Daniel gave a small shrug. One of them lost the fight. Lily walked over and leaned against the counter. You were gone longer than usual. Ran into someone? The answer came out neutral. Maybe too neutral. Lily's eyes narrowed slightly. She had inherited that habit from him, watching people carefully before asking the next question. Who? Daniel reached for the milk carton. Old friend. That sound carried more curiosity than the word itself. She grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl and spun it slowly on the counter. Guy or girl? Daniel paused halfway through putting the milk in the fridge. Girl. Lily's eyebrows lifted immediately. Oh? Daniel shut the fridge door. Don't start. I didn't start anything, she said with a small smile. I just asked. He moved around the counter, tossing the broken eggs into the trash. What friend? He hesitated just a fraction too long. Lily noticed. That kind of friend? Daniel sighed quietly. Her name's Evelyn. The apple stopped spinning under Lily's fingers. She didn't say anything right away. Instead, she studied his face in that same careful way she always did when she sensed something deeper than a casual answer. Evelyn, she repeated slowly. Daniel nodded. Another pause stretched across the kitchen. Then Lily said something he hadn't expected. The photo. Daniel looked at her. What photo? The one in your desk drawer. He leaned back slightly against the counter. You've been snooping. I wasn't snooping, she said quickly. You asked me to grab a pen from there last year. It was right on top. Daniel rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. She's the one, isn't she? Not a question, really. Lily already knew the answer. Daniel exhaled slowly. Yeah. Lily pushed the apple aside and folded her arms. So she just appeared. Pretty much. Her eyes widened slightly. After 20 years, Daniel nodded again. Lily leaned back against the counter now, processing. That's kind of dramatic. He gave her a look. Life isn't a movie. I know, she said quickly. But still, she paused. What did she want? Daniel thought about the park, the swing chains creaking. Evelyn's hands folded together while she spoke. Her father's dying. Lily's expression shifted. Oh, and apparently he has something to say to me. Why? Daniel picked up the paper towel again, wiping a spot on the counter that was already clean, because according to her, he's the reason she left. The kitchen went very quiet. Lily blinked. Wait. She leaned forward slightly. Are you serious? That's what she says. Lily stared at him. And you believe her? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rinsed his hands in the sink, watching the water run over his fingers. I don't know what I believe yet. Lily studied him carefully. You look like you believe something. Daniel turned off the faucet. That man told her I walked away. Her mouth opened slightly. What? Apparently I went to him asking for money to leave town. Lily shook her head immediately. That doesn't even sound like you. Daniel gave a faint, tired smile. Thank you for the vote of confidence. I'm serious. She pushed away from the counter and paced a few steps across the kitchen floor. So he lied to both of you? That's the story? Lily stopped walking. And now he wants to talk. Daniel nodded. Through her. Lily folded her arms again. Are you going? The question landed heavier than she probably intended. Daniel leaned back against the counter. I told her I'd think about it. Lily studied him for a long moment. You're angry. Maybe. You should be. Daniel didn't respond. The truth was more complicated than that. Anger had been easier 20 years ago. Back then it had shape and direction, something to push against while he built a different life. Now it felt older, thicker, harder to sort through. Lily spoke again, quieter this time. Do you still care about her? Daniel looked at his daughter. The question wasn't childish curiosity. It came from a place of careful thought. He considered lying. Instead, he said the only honest thing that came to mind. I never stopped. Lily absorbed that quietly. She nodded once, slowly. Then you probably need to hear whatever that man has to say. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. That simple? She shrugged. Not simple, just necessary. Daniel watched her for a moment. Sometimes she surprised him with how clearly she saw things. Lily picked up the apple again. Also, she added casually, I want to meet her. Daniel blinked. What? If she mattered that much to you, I want to know who she is. He opened his mouth to object. But Lily was already walking toward the hallway again. Think about it, she called back. You always say the past matters because it shapes people. Her bedroom door closed a moment later. Daniel remained in the kitchen. The house had grown quiet again. He looked down at the empty egg carton in the trash, then toward the window where the street lights glowed faintly through the glass. Evelyn had stepped back into his life like someone reopening a chapter he thought had already ended. And now the next page was waiting. He just hadn't decided yet whether to read it. Daniel didn't sleep well that night. He lay awake longer than usual, staring at the faint lines of light on the ceiling where the street lamp filtered through the curtains. The house was quiet. Lily's music had stopped hours earlier. Even the neighborhood seemed settled, but his mind kept circling the same places. Her father's office. That afternoon 20 years ago, Daniel hadn't thought about it in a long time. Or maybe he had simply trained himself not to follow the memory too far. Back then, things had moved quickly. Too quickly to question every detail. Now those details were returning one by one. He remembered the smell of polished wood in the man's office. The way the blinds had been half closed even though it was still daylight. Papers stacked neatly across the desk, each one aligned like it mattered where it sat. And the way the man had looked at him. Not angry, not even hostile. Just certain that Daniel didn't belong in whatever future he had planned for his daughter. Daniel turned onto his side. The mattress creaked quietly. He remembered the conversation clearly now. At the time it had felt strange, but not unbelievable. People with money often carried themselves like that. Calm, direct, like everything could be solved with the right arrangement. You're a hard-working young man, the older man had said. Daniel had stood across the desk, hands still rough from work at the garage. "Thank you. But you and Evelyn, you're moving too fast." Daniel remembered the way he had frowned at that. "We're not asking permission." The man had smiled slightly at that. Not insulted, just amused. "You misunderstand me. I'm not forbidding anything." Then he leaned back in his chair. "I'm simply offering perspective." Daniel stared up at the ceiling now. Back then he had believed the man's words were nothing more than disapproval dressed up politely. He hadn't realized they were something else. The memory continued. "You have potential," the man had said. "But raising a child at your age will limit that." Daniel had felt irritation rise in his chest. "We're already planning it." That had been the truth. They had talked about it for months. Late nights sitting on the old couch in Evelyn's apartment, imagining small things. What kind of place they might live in, whether the baby would have her eyes or his. The man across the desk had simply nodded. "Of course." Then he slid a piece of paper across the desk. Daniel remembered staring at it. A job offer, not local, 3 states away. "Good salary," the man had said calmly. "Housing included for the first year." Daniel had looked up slowly. "I didn't apply for this." "No, but I made a call." "And why would you do that?" The man's answer had come without hesitation. "Because sometimes young people need help making decisions that are good for them." Daniel remembered the feeling that had moved through his chest then. Not fear. Something sharper. "I'm not leaving." The older man had studied him for a moment. Then he had folded the paper neatly and set it aside again. "Very well." Daniel thought the conversation had ended there. He hadn't known that another version of that conversation was about to be told somewhere else. Back in the present, Daniel closed his eyes. The memory shifted again. He remembered the last thing the man had said before he left. "You should think carefully about the future you're choosing." Daniel had answered without hesitation. "I already did." At the time he'd walked out of that office certain about one thing. Nothing the man said would change anything. He had no idea that the real conversation would happen later, without him. Daniel turned onto his back again. The clock beside the bed read 2:17 a.m. He let out a slow breath. 20 years. 20 years of believing Evelyn had decided he wasn't enough. 20 years of slowly reshaping his life around that absence. And now she was saying the decision had never been hers. Or his. The ceiling above him remained still and quiet. After a long time, Daniel sat up. The floorboards were cool beneath his feet as he walked to the kitchen. He poured a glass of water and leaned against the counter. The house looked different at night, simpler somehow. He thought about Lily's words earlier. "You probably need to hear whatever that man has to say." Daniel took a slow drink. He wasn't sure forgiveness was possible yet. That wasn't even the question. The real question was whether he wanted to carry the uncertainty any longer. Because right now, the past sat half open in front of him, and unfinished things had a way of staying heavy. He set the glass in the sink. For a long moment he stood there looking at the dark window. Then he reached for his phone. Evelyn's number sat at the top of the recent calls list. He had saved it earlier without really thinking. Daniel stared at the screen. His thumb hovered over the message icon. Finally, he typed a single sentence. "When does he want to see me?" The message sent before he had time to reconsider. Daniel set the phone down on the counter. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street. Inside the house, everything remained still. A few minutes later, the phone vibrated softly. He picked it up. Evelyn's reply was short. "Tomorrow afternoon." Daniel read the message twice. Then he locked the screen and placed the phone back on the counter. The decision had already been made, and for the first time in many years, Daniel felt the past beginning to move again. The next afternoon arrived slower than Daniel expected. Morning moved normally at first. Coffee. The quiet rustle of the newspaper. Lily passing through the kitchen half awake, tying her hair up while asking if there was any bread left. Ordinary sounds. Daniel answered her the way he always did. Calm. Measured. Nothing in his voice gave away that the day carried something heavier inside it. But the hours stretched. He tried fixing the loose hinge on the back gate. Then he reorganized a drawer in the garage that didn't really need organizing. At one point, he found himself standing in the middle of the driveway holding a wrench without remembering why he had picked it up. His thoughts kept circling the same place. The hospital. That was where Evelyn said her father was staying now. Private room. Quiet floor. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and checked the time again. 1018 p.m. He had agreed to meet them at 2. Inside the house, Lily sat at the kitchen table with a laptop open, typing something for one of her classes. She glanced up when Daniel walked in. "You're pacing." "I'm not pacing." "You're pacing with tools." Daniel looked down at the wrench still in his hand. He placed it on the counter. "Going somewhere?" she asked. He nodded. Lily studied his face. "The hospital." Daniel nodded again. She closed the laptop slowly. "So you decided?" "Yes." Another pause. "Do you want me to come?" Daniel shook his head almost immediately. "No." Lily didn't argue. Instead, she stood and walked around the table. "You'll tell me what happens, though." "Of course." She stopped in front of him. Her expression had changed slightly. Less curious now. More careful. "If he really lied to both of you, that's a lot to carry for 20 years. Daniel exhaled slowly. "Yes." "Don't let him explain it away too easily." "I won't." Lily nodded. Then she stepped forward and hugged him briefly. It surprised him. She wasn't usually the kind of person who did that without a reason. "Just come back, okay?" she said. Daniel gave a small smile. "It's a conversation, not a boxing match." "I know." But she didn't sound fully convinced. Daniel grabbed his jacket from the chair by the door. "Try not to burn the house down while I'm gone." Lily rolled her eyes. "Please. I survived 19 years with you." He stepped outside before she could say anything else. The afternoon air carried that faint early spring chill. Not cold exactly, just sharp enough to make people keep their hands in their pockets. Daniel drove slowly across town. Traffic lights, long stretches of road, familiar buildings passing by the window. He had driven these streets thousands of times over the years. Today, they felt different. The hospital stood near the river on a quiet hill, a large brick building with wide windows reflecting the gray sky. Daniel parked near the entrance and sat in the car for a moment. 2 o'clock, right on time. He stepped out and walked inside. Hospitals always smelled the same, clean in a way that never quite felt comfortable. The lobby was quiet. A receptionist glanced up briefly when he approached. "I'm here to see Mr. Chen." She checked the computer. "Fourth floor, room 417. Daniel nodded his thanks and walked toward the elevators. The ride up felt longer than it probably was. When the doors opened, the hallway waiting for him looked almost empty. Pale walls, low lighting, the distant sound of a monitor beeping somewhere far down the corridor. Evelyn stood outside the room. She was leaning against the wall with her arms folded, staring at the floor. When she looked up and saw him, something in her posture loosened slightly. "You came." Daniel nodded. "You said 2." They stood there quietly for a moment. Up close, he could see how tired she looked. Not just from the day, something deeper. "How is he?" Daniel asked. Evelyn glanced toward the closed door. "Some days he's clear. Some days he drifts. And today, he's awake." Daniel studied the door. "You told him I might come." She nodded. "He's been asking every hour." Daniel let out a slow breath. The hallway remained silent around them. Finally, he asked, "What exactly does he want to say?" Evelyn shook her head slightly. "He said it has to be to you." Daniel absorbed that. After a moment, he stepped toward the door. But before he could reach the handle, Evelyn spoke again. "Daniel." He stopped. "If this turns into something you don't want to hear, you can leave." Her voice carried a quiet seriousness. "No one expects you to forgive him." Daniel looked at her for a long second. "I'm not here for forgiveness." Then he opened the door. The room inside was dim. Machines hummed quietly near the bed. Thin wires ran beneath the blankets. The curtains were half drawn, letting in pale daylight from the window. The man in the bed looked smaller than Daniel remembered. Age had hollowed out the sharp edges of his face. His hair, once perfectly dark, had turned almost completely white. But when his eyes opened and found Daniel standing in the doorway, something familiar returned to them. Recognition. The old man took a slow breath. "So, you did come." Daniel stepped further into the room. Evelyn remained near the door behind him. For a moment, none of them spoke. Then the man looked at Daniel with a strange mixture of relief and regret. "I owe you the truth." Daniel pulled a chair closer to the bed and sat down. The distance between them was only a few feet now. 20 years had led to this small, quiet space. Daniel folded his hands together and said calmly, "Then start talking." The old man didn't begin right away. His breathing was slow, uneven, the kind that came from lungs that had worked too many years. A monitor beside the bed marked each beat of his heart with a soft, patient rhythm. Daniel sat with his hands folded, waiting. He didn't look at Evelyn. He kept his eyes on the man in the bed. 20 years ago, that man had stood tall behind a wide desk, confident in every word he spoke. Now he looked smaller, his shoulders sinking into the hospital pillows, the lines on his face deeper than Daniel remembered. But the eyes were the same, sharp, careful. For a moment, the man studied Daniel the way he used to, like he was measuring something. Then he closed his eyes briefly and exhaled. "I expected you to hate me." Daniel didn't answer. The man opened his eyes again. "You probably should." Silence hung between them. Evelyn shifted slightly near the door but didn't interrupt. The man's voice came slower now. "When Evelyn told me she was pregnant, I thought my life had collapsed." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. "I had spent decades building something," the man continued. "A reputation, a company, a future for my daughter." Daniel leaned back slightly in the chair. "And I didn't fit into that picture." The man didn't deny it. "No." The honesty landed harder than an excuse would have. "I had plans for her," he said quietly. "Graduate school, travel, a career that would put her far beyond the limits I grew up with." His breathing paused for a moment, and then "She told me about you." Daniel felt the familiar pressure of old anger pressing against his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "So you decided to remove the problem." The old man closed his eyes again. "Yes." The word barely reached across the room. Evelyn looked down at the floor. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "You lied to both of us." "Yes." "You told her I walked away." "Yes." "You told me nothing." The man nodded weakly. Daniel stared at him. "Why?" The answer came slowly. "Because if either of you believed the other still wanted the future you planned, you would have fought for it." Daniel felt that truth settle heavily in the room. "And you didn't want that." "No." The monitor beside the bed beeped steadily. The man looked toward Evelyn for a moment, then back at Daniel. "I convinced her you had already chosen your freedom." Daniel said nothing. "I told her you asked me for money to leave." Evelyn's hands tightened where they rested against her arms. The old man continued. "And I told you nothing because silence was easier to believe than betrayal." Daniel let out a quiet breath through his nose. "You built two different stories." "Yes." "And expected them to hold forever." The man gave a faint, tired smile. "I underestimated time." Another long pause settled in the room. Daniel stood up and walked slowly toward the window. Outside, the river moved calmly through the city, reflecting the pale sky. He stayed there for a moment, letting the quiet stretch. Behind him, the old man spoke again. "I thought she would forget you." Daniel didn't turn around. "She didn't." "No." "And you thought I'd move on too." Another weak breath from the hospital bed. "I hoped." Daniel looked out across the water. "Instead, we spent 20 years believing the other one gave up." "Yes." The word carried more weight this time. Daniel finally turned back toward the bed. "You stole something from both of us." The old man didn't argue. "I know." Daniel walked back to the chair but didn't sit. "You stole years she could have had with her child's father." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "And years my daughter could have had. knowing the full truth about her family. The man's gaze dropped. I know. Daniel studied him carefully. Why tell the truth now? The question hung in the quiet room. The old man looked older suddenly, not just sick, worn down by something that had been waiting a long time. Because dying changes what matters, he said. Daniel didn't respond. I thought I had protected my daughter, the man continued slowly, but when she told me she still wondered about you after all these years, I realized I hadn't protected anything. He turned his head slightly toward Evelyn. I only replaced one pain with another. Evelyn's eyes glistened, but she didn't speak. The man looked back at Daniel, and when I saw the photograph she kept, I understood something else. Daniel frowned faintly. What photograph? Evelyn hesitated. The one from the lake, she said quietly. Daniel remembered it instantly. A cheap camera. A bright afternoon. Both of them laughing because the wind had knocked over the tripod just before the picture snapped. He hadn't thought about that photo in years. She kept it, Evelyn said softly. Daniel looked at her, surprised. The old man's voice returned, weaker now. People who truly leave don't keep photographs like that. Daniel remained standing. So guilt finally caught up with you? Yes. The word came without defense. Another long silence filled the room. Then the old man reached slowly toward the small table beside the bed. His hand trembled slightly as he picked up a thin envelope. He held it out toward Daniel. For Lily. Daniel frowned. What is it? A letter. Daniel didn't move. The man's voice dropped even lower. She deserves to know the truth from the man who helped take it from her. Daniel stared at the envelope for a moment. Then he stepped forward and took it. The paper felt light in his hand, but the weight of it settled somewhere deeper. The old man leaned back against the pillows, exhausted now. I can't return the years I took from you, he said quietly. No, but I can at least stop the lie from continuing. Daniel looked down at the envelope, then back at the man in the bed. The anger inside him hadn't disappeared, but something else had entered the room now. Something heavier. Time. 20 years of it. And the quiet understanding that nothing said here could undo what had already been lost. Daniel slipped the envelope into his jacket pocket. Then he said the only honest thing he could find. You don't get forgiveness today. The old man nodded faintly. I didn't expect it. Daniel turned toward the door. But before he left, the man spoke one last time. Take care of them. Daniel paused. Them. My daughter. And yours. Daniel stood there for a moment. Then he walked out of the room without answering. Evelyn followed a few seconds later. The hallway felt wider now. Neither of them spoke at first. Finally, Evelyn asked quietly, Did he tell you everything? Daniel looked down the long corridor. Yes. Her voice trembled slightly. And? Daniel exhaled slowly, and now we figure out what to do with the truth. The elevator ride down felt longer than the one up. Daniel stood with his hands in his jacket pockets, staring at the brushed metal doors while the numbers above them dropped slowly. 4, 3, 2. The soft mechanical hum filled the small space. Evelyn stood beside him but didn't speak. Not yet. The letter in Daniel's pocket pressed lightly against his chest. Just paper. Thin. Easy to fold. But the knowledge inside it felt heavier than anything he had carried in a long time. The doors opened onto the quiet hospital lobby. They walked outside together. Cold air moved across the parking lot, carrying the faint smell of rain from somewhere upriver. The sky had darkened while they were inside. Late afternoon, sliding toward evening, Daniel stopped near the row of parked cars. For a moment he simply stood there, looking out across the hill toward the river below. Evelyn waited. I kept thinking about something while he was talking, Daniel said finally. His voice was calm, but there was a tiredness inside it now. What? She asked. Daniel rubbed his thumb along the edge of the envelope in his pocket. How different things could have been if just one of us had asked one more question. Evelyn lowered her gaze. I ask questions, she said quietly. Daniel turned toward her. What kind? The kind people ask when they're already afraid of the answer. Her words landed softly but firmly. Daniel understood what she meant. Questions shaped by doubt instead of trust. Back then everything had been moving fast, young plans. A baby coming, two people trying to build something before the world had finished deciding what to do with them. Fear had slipped easily into the cracks. I should have come to you directly, he admitted. I should have forced the conversation. Evelyn shook her head slightly, and I should have come to you when he told me that story. They both fell silent. Cars moved slowly through the lot around them. Hospital visitors coming and going with tired faces and quiet voices. Daniel leaned back against the hood of his truck. You kept the photograph, he said after a moment. Evelyn looked up. Yes. Why? The answer came without hesitation, because it was real. Daniel studied her face. That day at the lake, nothing about it was confused or complicated. Her voice softened slightly. It was just us. The memory surfaced again in Daniel's mind. Bright sunlight on the water, wind pushing the small boat sideways while they laughed about not knowing how to steer properly. For a second, he could almost hear that laughter again. Then the present returned. And you kept that for 20 years, he said. Yes. Daniel looked down at the pavement. I kept something too. Evelyn waited. The hospital bracelet. Her eyes widened slightly. Lily's? Daniel nodded. They gave it to me the day she was born. He ran a hand across the back of his neck. I figured one day I might show it to her and explain why things didn't work out. Evelyn's voice came quieter now. What did you end up telling her instead? Daniel shrugged faintly. Just that life doesn't always follow the plans people make. Evelyn looked toward the river again. That sounds like you. Daniel let out a small breath. Simple answers are easier when a kid's asking the questions. Another pause settled between them. Finally, Evelyn said the thing that had clearly been waiting behind everything else. Are you angry with me? Daniel didn't respond immediately. He watched a pair of nurses crossing the parking lot toward the entrance, their voices low as they spoke to each other. Anger was still there, somewhere. But it didn't sit where it once had. Not sharp, not fresh, just old. I spent a lot of years thinking you chose to leave, he said slowly. I know. I built my life around that idea. Evelyn nodded. I understand. Daniel studied her face. You never came back to check. The words weren't an accusation, just a fact. Her shoulders tightened slightly. I tried once. Daniel frowned. When? About 6 months after Lily was born. He blinked. What? Evelyn nodded slowly. I came to your old apartment. Daniel's mind shifted quickly through memories. The apartment above the repair shop. The narrow stairway. The cracked window in the kitchen. You weren't there anymore, she said. I moved. I know that now. Daniel rubbed his forehead. Where did you think I went? I didn't know. She exhaled slowly, and at that point, I believed you had chosen to disappear. Daniel absorbed that quietly. Two people moving through the same city at different times, carrying completely different versions of the same story. It almost would have been funny if it hadn't cost so much. What happened after that? He asked. Evelyn looked down at her hands. I finished school. Took a job overseas for a few years. Daniel nodded slowly. Running away? Maybe. She didn't deny it. I needed distance from everything that reminded me of what I thought I had lost. Daniel understood that more than he expected. Eventually I came back, she continued. And your father? He never mentioned you again. Daniel leaned his head back slightly, staring at the darkening sky. The man upstairs had spent 2 decades carrying a lie large enough to reshape 3 lives, and now it sat between them like something fragile that might break again if handled the wrong way. Evelyn spoke carefully. I didn't come back into your life to reopen wounds. Daniel gave a small nod. I figured. I just couldn't let the truth stay buried after I learned it. The honesty in her voice felt steady. Daniel pushed himself off the truck. Lily wants to meet you. Evelyn blinked. Your daughter said that? She's curious. A faint smile appeared at the corner of Evelyn's mouth. I can't blame her. Daniel took a slow breath. Maybe dinner tomorrow. Evelyn looked surprised. Are you sure? No. The answer was simple, but it seems like the next step. Evelyn nodded slowly. I'd like that. Daniel opened the truck door. Before getting in, he paused. There's still a lot we don't know about each other anymore. Evelyn met his gaze. I know. And some things might stay complicated. That's okay. Daniel studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and climbed into the truck. The engine started with its usual rough rumble. As he pulled out of the hospital parking lot, the envelope in his pocket shifted slightly. A letter meant for Lily. Words written by the man who had quietly changed the direction of all their lives. Daniel didn't know yet what those words would do once they were read. But he knew one thing. The past had finally spoken. And now the future would have to answer. Daniel drove home slowly. The road seemed narrower than usual, or maybe it was just the weight in his chest making the familiar streets feel smaller. The envelope in his pocket pressed against him like a secret heartbeat. He kept his hands on the wheel, gripping tightly, letting the rhythm of driving anchor him. By the time he pulled into the driveway, the sun had nearly set. Street lights flickered on. Shadows stretched across the lawn. Lily's bike leaned against the garage, half forgotten from the morning ride. He stepped out of the truck, taking the envelope in his hand. The paper felt heavier now, not from the weight of it, but from what it carried. 20 years of missing pieces, finally delivered to the right hands. Inside, the house smelled faintly of dinner being prepared. Lily hummed softly in the kitchen, chopping vegetables. She looked up when Daniel came in. You're late, she said, not as a complaint, but as an acknowledgement. Daniel gave a small shrug, holding the envelope behind his back. Traffic. Lily frowned. You're hiding something. He let out a soft breath. Maybe? She approached slowly. Is it? Her voice trailed off, waiting for him to confirm what she already guessed. He held the envelope out to her. She took it carefully, as if it were made of glass. Daniel watched her face as she unfolded the paper. Her eyes moved across the words. Fast. Slow. Back again. Finally, she looked up at him. Her expression was quiet, serious, thoughtful. What is it? She asked. A letter from someone who tried to decide what our lives should be without us, Daniel said. Someone who didn't get it right. Lily nodded slowly. The corners of her mouth turned upward faintly. I can see that. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, folding his hands. He could feel Evelyn's presence in the quiet stillness of the room, even though she wasn't there. Somehow, just knowing she was nearby in this part of the story made it feel softer. She said you kept a photograph, he said, breaking the quiet. From that day at the lake. Lily glanced at him, eyes narrowing slightly. I think I understand why. Daniel waited. Because some things can't be replaced, she said softly. He exhaled, a little of the tension leaving his chest. Exactly. The envelope lay between them now, a tangible connection to the past, heavy with words, but finally real. Daniel looked at his daughter and realized something. She had carried her own questions for years, quiet ones, tucked into corners waiting. And now, together, they could begin to answer them. The house seemed warmer somehow. Shadows softened against the walls, the ordinary smell of cooking, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the quiet rhythm of home. Daniel noticed it all for the first time in a long while. He didn't know what would happen next. Forgiveness wasn't ready yet. Neither was full trust. But for the first time in 20 years, he could feel the possibility of moving forward. And that felt enough. The next morning, Daniel woke early. Sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, spilling across the floor. Lily was already up, her small footsteps moving back and forth in the kitchen. The faint smell of toast and coffee drifted through the house. Ordinary things, but Daniel noticed them all. Each one a small anchor to the life he had built in the absence of what had been lost. He dressed slowly, not rushing. His hands lingered over buttons, the simple rhythm of getting ready giving him space to think. Evelyn's visit today would mark a new step, but he didn't know if it would be a small step or a large one. In the kitchen, Lily had the envelope spread out, reading it again with care. The handwriting was deliberate, controlled, the words precise. Daniel watched her quietly from the doorway. She didn't look up. Not yet. "It's weird," she said finally, her voice soft. "He sounds human." Daniel gave a faint, humorless smile. "Human doesn't always mean right." "I know," she said. "But he finally said something real. Not excuses." Daniel nodded. That was true. 20 years of silence and misdirection had ended with honesty, even if it came too late. Breakfast passed in quiet reflection. Toast, coffee, scrambled eggs. Daniel kept his eyes on Lily, observing her small movements, the way she paused before reaching for the butter, the way her hair fell across her forehead. He realized he hadn't noticed these details for a long time. Not like this. Then the doorbell rang. Daniel's chest tightened slightly. He knew who it would be before he reached the door. He opened it slowly. Evelyn stood there, carrying nothing but herself and a faint hesitance in her eyes. Her posture was straight, careful, but there was a softness Daniel hadn't noticed before. 20 years had changed them both. "Hi," she said. "Hi," Daniel replied. Short, calm, neutral, honest. She glanced past him. "Hi, Lily." Lily was behind him now, hands folded loosely. She studied Evelyn for a long moment before offering a small nod. "I thought we could have lunch together," Evelyn said. "Hear her out, whatever works." Daniel stepped aside. "Come in." Evelyn entered quietly, almost tentatively. She set her bag down on a chair and looked around. The house was simple, familiar, warm in a way that didn't try to impress. They all sat down at the table. No one spoke immediately. The morning light stretched across the kitchen, falling on the three of them. Ordinary, quiet, heavy with possibility. Finally, Evelyn said, "Thank you for letting me come." Daniel nodded. "We're listening." Lily shifted slightly. "I just want to know you a little." Evelyn smiled faintly. "I'd like that." The conversation started slow. Casual questions, short answers. Observations about the city, the weather, small things that mattered only because they had been missed for so long. Then, gradually, the gaps began to close. Evelyn laughed softly at something Lily said. Daniel noticed the soundlight, genuine, not the strained attempt at conversation he remembered from before. It settled in the kitchen. For the first time in decades, Daniel realized that this quiet, fragile reconnection was the foundation they could build upon. He didn't know what the future held. Forgiveness wasn't complete. Trust wasn't fully earned. But the walls had been cracked. And for now, that was enough. Daniel watched them together for a moment, and he understood something simple. Time couldn't be returned, but it could be reshaped. And maybe, just maybe, what had been lost could become something new. The afternoon stretched quietly. Lunch was simple. Sandwiches and soup. Lily poured the drinks. Daniel cleared the plates. Evelyn helped where she could. Conversation came in small, careful pieces. Nothing rushed. No grand gestures. No dramatics. Just three people figuring out how to exist in the same space again. At one point, Lily set the letter on the table. She had read it twice already, and now she looked at both of them. "It's a lot," she said softly. "But I get it now. How things happened. Why people did what they did." Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't add anything. Nothing could make up for 20 years lost. But he didn't need to. Lily understood that already. Evelyn reached across the table, lightly brushing Lily's hand. The movement was tentative, careful, almost as if testing gravity. Lily didn't pull away. She let her hand stay. Daniel watched them. Something shifted in his chest. Not relief, exactly. Not joy, not yet. But something steady. Solid. After lunch, Daniel suggested a walk. The air had warmed slightly. Spring was arriving. Shadows softened. They moved slowly, side by side, past familiar streets, the faint sound of traffic, birds and distant children playing. The conversation was gentle at first. Then it became sharper, more honest. Words that had been unspoken for decades surfaced naturally. Questions, clarifications, confessions. Daniel realized the weight of truth could be handled without drama, without force. It only needed space and attention. At a small park, they stopped by a bench. Lily sat between them. Daniel didn't speak at first. He just watched. Evelyn looked at him, and he saw her eyes searching for something: acceptance, maybe, or permission. Daniel's hand found hers. Light, brief, steady. A reminder of what had existed and still might. Evelyn's fingers closed around his for a moment. Lily watched quietly, a small, approving smile. "I didn't think this could feel okay," Daniel said finally. Evelyn shook her head softly. "Neither did I. But it does." Lily spoke then, her voice small but certain. "We can fix some things, make them better. Together." Daniel smiled faintly. Not the big, careless smile of youth. Something quieter, measured, real. "Yes," he said, "we can." They stayed on the bench for a long time, saying little, letting the afternoon sun settle around them. Daniel realized the truth. The past could not be undone, but it could become something meaningful, something that didn't weigh them down anymore. Later, back at the house, Daniel placed the envelope safely in a drawer. Not hidden, not forgotten. Preserved. A reminder of what had been lost and what they had begun to rebuild. Evening fell, and the light softened across the kitchen. The three of them moved with quiet ease. Laughter came softly, pauses filled with thought, words spoken and unspoken blending into a rhythm that felt like home. Daniel looked at Evelyn, then at Lily. 20 years had changed them all, but the change was no longer only loss. It was possibility, forgiveness, reconnection. And as the night drew in, he understood finally that love, true love, never really disappeared. It merely waited, waiting to be remembered, acknowledged, and allowed back in. Daniel reached across the table, and Evelyn's hand found his. Lily watched, smiling faintly. This time, there would be no running, no silence, only what they could build together. And for the first time in decades, Daniel felt the quiet weight of the past lift just enough to let him breathe again. The house was calm, the future uncertain but open, and that, Daniel thought, was enough.